Let's talk about the QB scoring profiles around fantasy football and what you need to crush your fantasy football drafts in 2025. That's what we're going to talk about on today's show. I'm joined by Rich Hribar. Rich will be able to have some laughs over this, but this is the second intro we're doing, so we're going to speed our way right through it. I forgot to click the record button as we kick things off, but I was going to say it's good when you realize that, 90 seconds into the recording rather than 19 minutes into the recording. So we have a fun topic of conversation today where we're going to look at some of the second and third year quarterbacks and who is ready to take that jump to the next level at the QB position and look at it through the lens of Konami quarterbacks. But Rich, Monday morning for you, Monday afternoon for me, how are you feeling as we approach the NFL draft here?
Yeah, I am grateful that you did, notice that at least right in the intro, you gotta hit that record button. You record that hour pod, and then you're just like, all right, oh hey, I didn't get any of that. You're gonna do it again and run it back, and so I'm grateful that you did notice that. But no, I'm excited to come and just talk about something, take a break from the rookies, and I don't mind it because this time comes along every year. It's exciting. We've got new players entering the NFL. It's exciting, right? Like you're hoping that we get more players because even though like us as fantasy analysts, like we might even talk negatively about a player or something, I guarantee you though, all of us want as many good players or as many fantasy viable players as possible. So anytime we get like a new injection of talent into the league, it is just always an exciting time. So we want as many good fantasy players as we could possibly have.
Yeah, 100%. And putting together the show sheet for today and looking at some of the second, third year players, and also looking at what we're going to tease this for the show later in this week. We're going to talk about the wide receivers going into their sophomore season. And you look at those names and you're like, we got a real influx of talent to fill out QB and wide receiver in 2024. And, we're talking now about this year's class. And maybe it's not as stacked at those positions, but it's going to be loaded up at the running back position. And you're kind of filling those fantasy football, top 10 rounds for the next like 5 to 6 years with stockpiling talent. So that is what we want to see. So I 100% agree with you there. Rich, we'll have people tuning in, I'm sure, that are familiar with your work and familiar with what, over the years, how the quarterback position as well has evolved. But something that I've talked to you a few times about over the years is the Konami Code quarterback. And, when we look at how things have evolved, Superflex now have been one of the main formats when people look at Dynasty, but the evolution of the quarterback position over the last 10 years and then how it is in fantasy with, the way you would prioritize certain talents at certain positions and how we work out ADPs based on the skill set of particular players with the rushing upside and so on. What is your definition at this point in time for a Konami Code QB?
It has changed a little bit over the years. When I first wrote the original article, which dating myself here, I wrote it in 2013.
Yeah, it's like when you were hitting off at the start, and I'm like, oh, I'm just going to come out to the listeners and own up this mistake that I did. I'm like, rookie error. And I'm like, well, it's only taken like, probably 13 years of podcasting to get to this point. Like when am I going to learn? But then you're talking about an article. I started in podcast in 2013. You're mentioning the Konami Code, write-ups from that time. Sean talks about the 0RB coming out at that time. It's like, it was a real pivotal point for a lot of the stuff we talk about, but it feels wild now to be like, 12 years ago.
But yeah, I mean, that original article was kind of written on the premise that, these quarterbacks that give you rushing output, the rushing is obviously weighted. It's a weighted component in terms of scoring, as in just the rushing points get you more points than the passing points. And it was always kind of misunderstood that type of quarterback, like at then it was like centered around like Tim Tebow. Terrell Pryor was going to be starting for the Raiders. We had some guys like Cam Newton, that was in like, that was before like Cam Newton had the 2015 season and was like churning out, the floor-based like QB1 production. And it was literally saying like, hey, these guys aren't volatile as their passing stats indicate. They actually are largely high floor quarterbacks because the rushing component's so weighted for their performance that they just kind of give you these back-end QB1 performances and then over a full season give you this QB1 output. But like your father-in-law would never pick them in like your home league because they'd be like, this dude's a bad quarterback. Why would I pick a bad quarterback? And it was kind of centered around that and how you could kind of take advantage of that archetype. Now, what has happened, though, because of just evolution, human evolution, and we're getting more athletes playing the position than ever before, that we've started to see now that these guys that have rushing acumen can now throw the ball, too. And now when you combine those two worlds where you're getting these front end passing seasons paired with, the rushing quarterbacks, you're just able to turn in these types of seasons that just can't be combated in fantasy football. Like I mentioned, like that 2015 Cam Newton season. Obviously, the 2010 Michael Vick season is kind of what stands out in like everyone's mind for like, like how do you even beat this dude? He's putting up 40 points every game. And we've seen that gamers now understand that archetype. And you look at QB ADP, I mean, even right now, like you see those guys that are capable of those seasons, like all at the front. And it's what held like Anthony Richardson's ADP last year, being elite. People just understand that if this all comes together, this is one of these types of players that can't be combated for fantasy football. And that's what kind of, like I said, like floats their ADP, because every year, like you'll be able to arbitrage like passing, like you always can every year. Every year there's a guy that's like how Baker Mayfield has been these past years, or Jared Goff this last year. Like you can always find pocket passers that just run into hot seasons, and you pick those guys up off of waivers, and you're able to kind of manifest stuff. So even though like people bricked in Anthony Richardson, I still think you have to go back to the well and like still target that archetype of quarterback, because you have so many pocket passers. There's so much insulation between the waiver wire in one QB's this formats that is. Because you look at it even last year, I mean, the rushing bubble is yet to pop. We still haven't, until we have 32 of these guys, it's not going to happen. I mean, even last year, quarterbacks set another record. They ran for over 11,000 yards, another NFL record. They had 107 rushing touchdowns. It's the third consecutive year quarterbacks have had over 100 rushing touchdowns in the NFL. One of the big things that's going to be interesting to think about this offseason is that tush push ban, right? Like, if it does somehow pass, like there is a little bit of an impact here, because that's where the area where like the quarterbacks do a lot of their damage is inside the 5-yard line, where you force a defense to play 11 on 11 football. Like that's where you see like the designed runs and the designed quarterback runs really kind of take hold and like turn into scoring plays to those teams. But yeah, especially the tush push though, I'm very interested to see what happens. You look at a guy like Jalen Hurts. He is like one of those guys we talked about that's giving you a good enough passing plus the rushing floor, where he is an elite fantasy football quarterback. He has one scrambling rushing touchdown the past years, none last year. Of his career touchdowns, 55 rushing touchdowns, 32 are from the tush push alone. That's 60% of them.
That is wild when you tally it out like that as to how many it is. The other part, and like when we look at the top quarterbacks by ADP at the moment, you have Jayden Daniels, Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, then Jalen Hurts, who you mentioned, and Joe Burrow. And Burrow, the only one of those really that doesn't have, there's still some movement in terms of, if we look back 10 years ago, he would have been one of the guys who was probably a little bit more athletic from the kind of pocket complete passers. But it's evolved so much now to where, you're talking about those 40-point games, and those are the guys that are putting them up: Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts. But if you were to go into a situation where it's really going to affect Hurts the most in terms of the tush push, but it will, not from the scoring perspective, but how defenses are forced to line up against the offenses and account for everything. So that will be interesting. But something that's
it here. So last year, the highest scoring quarterback each week, if you just look at the individual weeks, the highest scoring back, those quarterbacks averaged 11.5 rushing points per game. Like that's how you turn in those. The ceiling weeks are always driven by that type of performance. And the only quarterbacks, when you look at just like the highest scores, every quarterback but two of those had rushing points. We had a Kirk Cousins game against Tampa Bay, that Thursday night game, where he had 0 rushing points and was the highest scoring quarterback. And we had a Burrow game against the Ravens. That was also a Thursday night game too. It's interesting. Yeah. But again, it took those guys 58, 56 pass attempts and throwing 4 passing touchdowns to get there. Like you can always run to a random week like that, but always that archetype of passing quarterbacks, like they're just going to have elite passing production. That's what makes Burrow's ADP so interesting. And some of the Burrow's ADP is going to be driven, of course, by best ballers just wanting to stack Burrow and Chase if they can do it, because you have that first round wide receiver. But Burrow's ADP is still very fragile. He's a guy probably just outside of stacking with Chase will never draft that highly, because that archetype quarterback is the #1 bust rate quarterback. Like we saw it again with CJ Stroud last year in that same bucket. And now CJ Stroud's going QB 18. But as good as Burrow is, and he's going to have years where he throws 40 passing touchdowns, we know that those exist in his range of outcomes. And like last year, you're just going to get some of those seasons. but it's still the most fragile archetype of quarterback. And you have that pocket like after Hurts where it's Burrow. And we've seen Mahomes the past 2 years, right? Like when Mahomes doesn't give you those just elite passing production seasons. And both those guys give you a little bit of rushing, but when they don't get that elite front end production, they don't live up to the ADP.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing. I mentioned the top five, and Mahomes is the sixth quarterback in best ball being drafted, but there is almost two full rounds between those guys above and then him.
Yeah.
And I think, like you mentioned about the way the game's evolving, one of the other things that has evolved is there's obviously more data to show these numbers and more ways to track it, but there's just more fantasy, information out there, more content every year over the last 4 or 5 years, and that's getting drafters then, sharpened up to what they need to do in their drafts to gain those kind of leverage areas. And if we even look back again, we're talking about the QBs here, but the evolution of the running backs, and if you go back like 20 years, people just wanted the touchdown scorers, who was getting those goal line carries, and then we go to PPR, and you're all of a sudden like getting huge values on guys who are going to catch 50 balls in a season because people were looking at it from the old school way. And when you're mentioning the points being scored by those top QB weeks, you're kind of like having an RB2 plus your quarterback if you're having the rushing quarterback versus just having your quarterback if you're just going for the pocket passing guys. So the evolution is interesting. But you mentioned CJ Stroud, and we are going to bump into what we think of some of these guys heading into this year. So what we're going to do is look at these third-year guys, because I think they're interesting. You also mentioned Anthony Richardson. The way the seasons and the careers of these guys have gone to start off, we get CJ Stroud, hit season as a rookie. We get Bryce Young, possibly worst case scenario as a rookie, gets benched in year 2. Then he's into the midpoint of year 2, and Andy Dalton gets in a car accident, which puts him back as the starting quarterback. And all of a sudden, this looks like a different guy. It looks kind of like a bit more like the college version of him. So what we're going to do is start off with year 3, but we're going to kind of try and have a bit of fun and set the expectations for them for the listeners. So we're going to have an option of priority target at ADP. You would consider 10 picks below ADP, a fade, or completely off the board. And this is going to set up for who we should be drafting and which also are most fitting off the kind of the profile with the rushing upside of the Konami quarterback. So I'm going to start off with Bryce Young, because I just find his first 2 seasons in the NFL both fascinating and almost baffling. The way it has gone. I would say we're looking at somebody who's like kind of in the mean of year 1 and year 2, but year 1 was so bad, but the second half of year 2 was so impressive how he came on. And sometimes people now, when they're drafting this year, are going to be looking at it and be like, he was so bad year 1, like it's going to be more like that. But there is just a chance that things clicked in year 2 and the team is now moving in a better direction with the pieces they'll be able to put him around him. Is there a situation here where we need to kind of forget year 1 and be like, what we've seen at the back half of year 2 is probably closer to Bryce Young? And then where does he fit in that list of priorities for you?
Yeah, there's still a lot of room for Bryce Young, to even grow. As good of the final 10 weeks were last year when he took back over. And perhaps there was some divine intervention at play too, because Andy Dalton was playing really poorly before he got in that car accident.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like, when are we going to give Bryce Young the job again? But over the final 10 weeks, he threw 15 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. He was number 1 at Pro Football Focus in big time throw rate, like throws into tight windows that were successful. He threw multiple passing touchdowns in the final 3 games. But even over that span, he was still just 18th in EPA, 27th in success rate, 27th in completion rate, 28th in yards per pass attempt. So there's still room to grow. But when you look at what happened, he had that Konami spike. He averaged 6.4 rushing points per game. The final 8 games of the season, only 1.7 per game prior to that. He was 6th in the NFL in scramble rate. That's a kind of unlock. Like he started actually just taking off, and he did a little bit of that at Alabama. Didn't do it as a rookie. And then didn't do it like the front half of when he got this initial sample. And then the back half, he started running around, and that started to give him more points. And gamers still, when you look at like his starting off ADP this offseason, gamers still really aren't buying in. This is still a team that has a good offensive line that they invested in, heavily these past 2 off seasons in terms of, free agents capital and then drafting rookies. We expect them to probably add another playmaker in this draft. I think when we get to kind of where we're going to talk about like Bo Nix, I don't see a big significance in like how they score fantasy points. So the gap from like Bo Nix to Bryce Young still feels very arbitrageable right now.
Well, that's interesting because we will talk about Knicks in a minute, and I was a big Knicks fan last year. I'm going to be a big Knicks fan this year.
And
But
this
he's
is like
QB,
where Knicks was going, like that QB
yeah,
24-ish range last
yep.
year.
He's
Yeah.
QB 24, and Knicks is up now to QB 9. So, and if we look at round by round in the FFPC Best Ball ADP, it's 8th round draft slot for Knicks, but you're down then all the way to round 13 for Bryce Young. And if you look through, like, the players going after him are well, Anthony Richardson's going after him, but we'll talk about him in a moment. Let's just go straight to Anthony Richardson. Actually, he's QB 27 going in the 14th round. We are seeing, again, as I mentioned, if we're looking at best ball ADP, we have the elite kind of options in round 3 and 4. Then you have Mahomes in round 6, round 7, Baker Mayfield. But then you're getting into that, Kyler, Bo Nix, Jared Goff. So there's some, good scoring there last year, but not necessarily at the elite level. But from round 10 through, round 13, that's where the majority of these QBs are going. You get QB 12, Justin Herbert at the start of round 10, all the way down then if we go to Bryce Young, quarterback 24. So there's 12 going in that round span. But when we talk about Anthony Richardson, obviously there's been some injury issues. There's been some very spike week impressive performances based on his rushing profile. But when he's in there, in terms of, like, if we're looking at his offensive pieces, it's very hard to take any other pieces on the offense, probably outside of Jonathan Taylor, based on his accuracy or lack of accuracy as a QB. Where are we sitting here? Like, I'm at the point where for fantasy, I would rather Daniel Jones be the quarterback here for the Colts. Where are you with Anthony Richardson?
Yeah, this is a tough spot. When I did my initial, resetting of the dynasty rankings, he was obviously the guy that took the biggest fall in terms of rankings, and also became one of the arguably the toughest guy at the position to kind of rank, and gauge kind of what we have. We've seen also, one thing we've seen recently in the NFL is that teams are way more willing to take on, like, some costs with these quarterbacks. I mean, just look at, like, since the 2021 draft. I mean, like, you got like Zach Wilson is on his third team, Mac Jones is on his third team, Trey Lance is on his third team, Kenny Pickett's on his third team. Like, these are all round 1 quarterbacks, right? Where you thought you at least had insulation. And in these super flex leagues, like, you would draft these guys based on just, like, hey, their currency, right?
They'll hold value.
And that's actually been something that's been sketchy. I think it's what's interesting. That's what makes Cam Ward kind of interesting in this draft, because, last year he might have been like the QB 5, the QB 6. And now in your Superflex leagues, he might be like pick 3. And, like, that's kind of, it feels fragile, like, in this context of this draft class, but that's another bridge to cross. But Anthony Richardson is just so hard to gauge, because even last year it was everything that we still kind of wanted in fantasy, like, except for early on, like, we weren't getting that run up. But when he took back over the job, he became that, like, high volatile, like, can give you a spike week quarterback. He was still 5th in points per drop back. The thing was, he was last in drop backs per game. So when and we see he's very much, we live this with Justin Fields, right? Like, so this is what's the thing about the Konami code is, and you want to apply as the dynasty. To be a sustained NFL quarterback, eventually you have to throw the football. And we've seen, like, Lamar Jackson manifest this game, especially these last 2 years under Todd Monk. And, like, Lamar's been, like, an awesome passer. Eventually you still have to throw the football. You can only get by so long to where you're just not exposed. And if you can't throw the football, a team's going to move on from you. And, like, so we did this with Justin Fields, even though from fantasy, Justin Fields keeps scoring fantasy points, right? And we're gonna be happy to draft him again where he's going this year, just because of that value. So if Richardson's starting, he does become a potential value, especially where he is. The reason why his ADP is, where it is that he was already benched for Joe Flacco in his second season. We talked about teams being able to willingly take these sunk costs on, and they're already talking about there's an open competition with Daniel Jones. So even if he wins that, like, you're always going to be thinking, like, all right, well, if he has a stretch where he played like weeks 2 through 4 last year, is he just going to get benched again? That's why his ADP will never, like, fully spike. He is, like, if I'm in a two QB league, I would, like, take shots on him, because if it does work out, like, there's just not a lot of quarterbacks at that type of ADP that you'd be like, this dude can absolutely kind of be like break that kind of format, and he would. But we just don't know if he's going to start the whole season. I think we would bet on both guys starting, right? Like, if I gave you odds on both quarterbacks starting, you would say, yeah, but Daniel Jones will make starts, Anthony Richardson will make starts. They probably end up resetting.
And even if we look at Richardson, even if his play was, what we want, his play style has left him open to the injuries that he's also occurred. So even if his play hadn't have been a concern, he has miss time each season as well. So I would be even more optimistic in Jones getting in. And the team does seem to be, you just get the vibes. Sometimes the team seems to be like, yeah, if he's not doing it, we'll just move on. Like, and a lot of teams I think are going to give those chances. We even seen it, like how quickly you talked about there with teams moving on from Fields, and then the Steelers not being 100% in on them this season again.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of it. And even when we get to the veteran contracts, because the cap has gone up so much, you never want to be just like wasting money. But like the Packers moved on to Love from Rodgers on a big contract. The Broncos moved on from Russell Wilson on the big contract and like at that cost. And then, we're seeing now that it's likely that, Penix is going to be the starter for the Falcons. And, they're going to have to move on from that massive contract situation they have with Kirk Cousins. So teams are moving on if the team is going to struggle because of it. A team that won't be moving on, but they decided they were going to move on from needing an offensive line this offseason was the Houston Texans. And like CJ Stroud last year, there was a lot of issues with his play, but part of it was also, I think, on the offensive line. But usually you would say, well, they'll fix that offensive line. They'll give them some more pieces. It's like, nope, we're just going to take away your key pieces on the offensive line and leave you with nothing. So CJ Stroud had, I don't know if we could say it was as high, but I think this time last year, if you looked at the expectations in the offseason, just a little bit below what we're seeing with Jayden Daniels this season. We thought he's taken that step and he's going to be the next thing here in the NFL. Last offseason, the clips were coming out. At some point there was the video clips of they're like, oh, he knows everything about every defense in the NFL and he's so sharp. And then all of a sudden, it fell apart for the Texans. There was obviously wide receiver injuries and so on to go along with it, but some of the plays from Stroud were just really suboptimal from his perspective. He now has fallen all the way to QB 18, right in the middle of that kind of range where we're talking about there, where I think that the talent that he showed in year one outweighs the situation in year two, but it's almost the opposite of what we're talking with Bo Nix. But I do think there was also some fundamental issues with him and with how the team is now setting things up with the offensive line moves and they're looking to be more defensive, and how much they went to Joe Mixon last year, I think, to their detriment. But what are you looking at here for Stroud in year three?
I compare Stroud a lot to what happened with Justin Herbert, right? Like we had the Justin Herbert start to his career,
Yeah.
And then Herbert honestly had almost the same parallel, right? Like when Herbert had Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, his stats were good. Those guys started to get hurt, and his stats kind of fell off. Same thing with the offensive line. They kept trying to build an offensive line around him. Not to the Houston hasn't really been tried to build an offensive line around Stroud, but things fell apart for that, and they weren't able to get the offensive line quite as good on the field as it was on paper, kind of entering those years. And the touchdown production fell off. Again, that leads back to the opening conversation we had, that archetype of quarterback. They're just going to have to always throw a lot of touchdowns. Stroud definitely also, like you said, some of that was his own doing. He got into some bad habits. His sack per pressure rate went way up, especially on third downs was way up. But then you look at it,
he took some dreadful sacks too, in terms of 20-yard sacks, just running in the wrong direction.
Yeah, but the same thing happened. Part of the reason people got excited about Stroud was not just the rookie season, was that they added, Stephon Diggs. He's gonna have Nico Collins, he's gonna have Stephon Diggs and Tank Dell. The insulation is all here. Well, he threw 66 total passes with all those guys on the field last year. He actually threw fewer passes last year with just Dell and Collins on the field than he did 2 years ago with Dell and Collins on the field, which was still under 200 plays. So he's had a pretty bad run out of even having healthy wide receivers on the field for 2 seasons. And then as a byproduct, he only has the 120-point game last year. But yeah, he does represent a little bit of a value this year, just because if he has a little bit of a better run out in terms of just surrounding cast staying healthy. We know that there's still talent there, like Herbert, right? When the Chargers started to throw the ball again, the back half of the year last year, Herbert started to get back. He crept back into that low end QB1 conversation. Because remember, the first half of the year, he was just like, this is a floor-based QB2 because they're not really throwing. And that's that's just where Stroud belongs, unfortunately. So he does represent a little value if you get that, because he fits in just that deep bucket of guys that, hey, if this guy's throwing touchdowns, he's going to be useful.
We're going to go into year two now and look at some of these names. And, I mentioned Jayden Daniels a moment ago, and the season that he has had as a rookie, just absolutely phenomenal in terms of some of the accuracy on his passes. Then when you add in the rushing ability, then when you factor in the amount of time during the season that he was playing obviously, restricted with, with a rib injury. They weren't rushing him for a certain portion of the midpoint of the season. And then he obviously finishes off making that run to the playoffs. So he is going, though, as QB3. I think we can say with clarity that he is a Konami Code style quarterback. He has the ability to completely break weeks in terms of his scoring. They have now added Deebo Samuel. We can see what they do through the draft if they add in, a higher profile running back. Are we, though? Where's the ceiling here in terms of drafting him versus him being QB3?
Yeah, I mean, he's definitely being drafted like where kind of like his ceiling would kind of, be expected to be. Like, you're not actually like, this isn't a value squeeze, but again, he's that archetype that you understand can break fantasy football. And then had the offseason run out of, like you said, he's getting a left tackle in Larry Tunsil. He's getting Deebo Samuel. They're probably not done even adding, like, if they add Travion Henderson, right? Like, they're rumored to add a running back and like someone else there. It's like, he's obviously getting that kind of influx. If you're looking for any type of regression, it would kind of just be like from the schedule-based stuff, right? Like, if you look at him, like they had just a ludicrous easy schedule last year. Now they're going to be facing, I believe they go from they faced the most teams with double-digit wins a year ago this season. So you're not getting that last place schedule, but there is a chance too for like some other regression. He actually kind of underachieved in the passing touchdown department, which could bounce back. I mean, you look at last year, he had just 3 passing touchdowns all season on throws that weren't into the end zone. And what I mean by that, like caught by a receiver and then run into the end zone. That was only one more than Trevor Lawrence. That was only Trevor Lawrence and Cooper Rush had fewer than him the whole season. Neither one of those guys played the entire season. So like you look at like a guy like Joe Burrow, like he had 18 of those passing touchdowns, right? Like where your receiver, so like he didn't have like some of those like where his receivers created touchdowns for him.
Yeah, I was going to say that could be, that's like the cast of characters he had around him. Is not the most like athletic, dynamic group.
And you say you add a guy like Deebo who like is the inverse of that. Like Deebo never gets end zone targets. He takes them in. He's running stuff in. Or you think like a Jared Goff, right? Like Jared Goff had 22 of those touchdowns that led the NFL. And
you're mentioning that number as well. And one of those is the Terry McLaurin kind of, against the Cowboys where he takes it like the whole, like, so it could have been even lower.
Yeah, so I mean, it's pretty crazy to think that he actually was a little bit unlucky and was still that good because again, like you're getting that rushing, and he ran a lot more as the season went on, and he got comfortable. His scramble rate really soared through the roof, like the final back half of the season. I mean, he had the highest scramble rate in the NFL the final 8 weeks of the season. So
I think that probably coincides too, as I mentioned, with the health element of it, where the team kind of took the wheels off a little bit. But he progressed as well as just reading the game and how he was evolving. So yeah, I think price absolutely fair, but it is going to affect the players.
But you're only going to have like one shot to really kind of take him, and it's the same thing. Really, like every year, I would love to have Josh Allen, right? Like I would love to have Josh Allen in every draft. But we're
trying to find other ways to get those points. But that's the thing with the Konami quarterbacks. If you can get Jayden Daniels last year in the the 9 through 13 range, where we're talking about those other names going, that wins you your championships. And it's just about, can you do that then at the top end? So we're going to go into some of the names.
He was my highest roster quarterback last year because of the way I play and then the ADP stuff. And we're going to try to find those guys this year.
That's what we're going to try and do again. The next one up, we touched on him there, is Bo Nix. Obviously, we're talking about Stroud and Cass. The running backs didn't do a lot for him last year in Denver. He didn't rush as much throughout the season as I was hoping that he may have. So hopefully we'll see that step forward. But if they can add a running back through the draft here that can add to that backfield overall, maybe some touchdowns coming out of the backfield from a passing perspective, and then you've Cortland Sutton, but I think we could do a lot more in that receiving game. It's going to be interesting to see how Evan Ingram fits in there in Denver. But anytime there's those pieces being put around a young quarterback is exciting. So Bo Nix, we kind of joked at the start that he is an arbitrage, or Bryce Young being an arbitrage to him this year. But what do you think of the QB9 price? Is he a target there?
Not really for me, and it's not really because I just dislike Bo Nix or anything. I just feel like that's kind of what you're getting. Like if you look at like he had basically 2 spike weeks last year. They're very opponent driven. I see him more as a guy I would love to have as like a rotational QB2, still a guy I still want to play matchups with because he's giving you more of like the
There's
floor.
a floor, yeah.
He's giving you like solid weeks, but like they're always in like that like QB like 9 to like QB.
He's going to get you like 18 to 22 points most weeks. Yeah.
And there are some weeks where he, like I said, he gave you the 2 real big spike weeks, but I still feel like where his ADP is, I don't think there's like a tremendous amount of squeeze, on him at that price point. I feel like he is arbitrage a little bit because like he's not just like a pure runner, right? Like you look at other guys, he has athleticism, but like we just talked about, like Bryce Young, like what's the real difference in how they're going to score fantasy points? And you feel a little bit safer in terms of Bo Nix for the insulation. Like Bo Nix isn't going to get benched this year. Like that still could exist in the range of outcomes for Bryce Young. Hell, his head coach that he still has benched him last year. So, but there's a reason why one guy's priced QB 24, one guy's QB 8, and I just feel like at that QB 8 pricing, it's just not something I feel like I'm going to be like gravitated towards. I just look at the guys going behind him. Like, I mean, Jordan Love being almost 3 rounds after him. Like, I would much rather have Jordan Love like at that price point versus like, yeah, I just feel like that's kind of where he's just like priced an area where I'm probably going to skip over him more often than click his name. But no real shade towards like Bo Nix the player.
That's what I was going to say. Same for me, and he fits into me for that category. I'll probably still draft him close to ADP, but if he was 10 picks below ADP, so if he's going 1 round later, I think
that's fair. So he'd be a guy I'd monitor at ADP because then that's great. That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and then going next, actually after Jordan Love, it's interesting you mentioned his name is Drake Maye, and we're looking here at the profiles. The team did really hold him back those last couple of weeks last year. Myself and Sean had some FFPC Main Event teams where we're like, oh, we start May, and I sent a clip to Sean of the head coach saying like we're not going to run and we don't want to risk any injury, and we're like, yeah, the upside's gone. But he did flash some of it last year, but there's not like when we're looking at surrounding cast, there's not much around Drake Maye in New England. Maybe that changes in the draft. When T Higgins was rumored to be hitting free agency, I was thinking if he lands there would be a huge help to Drake Maye. But what's your thoughts on him? I think that he kind of fits the profile overall, but QB 16.
Yeah, he's a guy at ADP I'm more willing to kind of say like we were in on Bo Nix last year, right? Because this was the argument for Bo Nix's ADP. It's like, well, who does he have around him, right? But we know that there was athleticism. We knew that the head coach was in place in Sean Payton to kind of, coax him out. When you look at like the way Bo Nix was used, it's funny. We talked about like the Jayden Daniels stuff. Bo Nix threw 7 touchdowns on throws that were behind the line of scrimmage last year, the most of the NFL. So his coach was putting him in a chance to have him succeed for fantasy football. And I do think we're going to have some of that with Drake Maye. I know Josh McDaniels has been like a terrible head coach anywhere he's gone, but like if you just look at his history though, like as an offensive coordinator, he's been hyper productive, and even
that's why he keeps getting head coach jobs,
and that's why he keeps getting head coach. Yes, exactly. And even if you remove the Brady years, like his last year with the Raiders, his last full season with the Raiders before he was fired, like what he got out of that types of talent in terms of what we had for like efficiency and fantasy production, like was really good. That last year with Cam Newton, when Cam Newton was really a shell of what Cam Newton was as a ceiling player, and the production he's able to kind of coax out of that Cam Newton offense. Like we should feel good about that hire of Josh McDaniels on his, I believe it's his 3rd tour with the Patriots as offensive coordinator. He's left comeback. And they do add Stephon Diggs. We want more weaponry here still too, but they add the right side of the line now is at least, has insurance. You add Morgan Moses at right tackle. You got Bradbury at center. And Wanwu was still at right guard. So like the right side of that line looks solidified where it was a disaster last year. Yeah. So like there are things that are moving in the right direction. And we have a young athletic player. When he took over as the starting quarterback, these are the only players that had more rushing yards than Drake Maye. Jayden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts. Those are the only 3 guys.
And that's me saying that they held him back. I think there's a lot more there. And I don't necessarily think that's been priced into his ADP at QB 16. When you're looking at these profiles, it's the same as like basically what you're trying to do now is pick out the 0 RB candidates here. And like if I'm looking through this list, he's the one that I could see being, QB 7. Like Baker Mayfield's QB 7, so maybe that's not enough of a leap, but he could vault himself into that tier, next year just below the Jalen Hurts group that we talked about earlier. If we next year another wide receivers coming into town and taking that jump up. I feel like the rushing profile he has could push him up. Like he's going one pick before Dak Prescott. He's just going just before CJ Stroud, but I think that he offers the Russian side that they don't necessarily have. The one that's next is quite interesting is JJ McCarthy, quarterback 22, obviously missed the whole rookie season. We're just going off his, rookie profile here pretty much when he's coming in. We know that there's a lot of talent in that offense in terms of like tight end and 2 wide receivers, maybe the most talented in the entire league. There's some very talented running backs there. So he's in a pretty good situation, but do you expect him to come in and start? And then what do you think of a scoring profile for him in 2025?
Yeah, he's another guy when you look at him at ADP, and he looks pretty appealing just based on we don't know. They're coming off the knee injuries. We just don't know how much like that's going to impact the mobility stuff because he does have that in his range of outcomes. But coming off the injury, we just don't know. It's just kind of a wild card, right? And like you said, we only had the 19 preseason dropbacks, so it's like not really anything we can go off of. Missed the whole season, but we do have like again the system belief is here. Like when we look at any type of functional quarterback play Kevin O'Connell's had, that player has also been relevant for fantasy football, not just Sam Darnold last year, but you go back the year before when they were running that like hodgepodge of guys after Kirk Cousins got hurt. And like Nick Mullins was
Josh Dobbs.
Nick Mullins was a good fantasy quarterback the weeks he got to start.
Yeah.
So at that type of price point where you're talking like, around the QB 20 range, like it's just something to take. It's just something to nibble on because of like the belief in the system, the belief in the profile, obviously the age still too. He was the youngest quarterback in the draft last year. Him and Drake Maye were tight. I think McCarthy might've been younger. They're real tight though, either way. So you're talking about a player though, that's still super young, that we're getting. And then you've got like the Justin Jeffersons, the Jordan Addisons, TJ Hawkinson coming back after the full year. Like the insulation here is just so much stronger to say like, yeah, if a guy's going to smoke his ADP, like this guy fits, he checks a lot of boxes, what we'd be looking for.
Yeah, and when we look at like where he's going, he's QB 22, but QB 20 is Michael Penix. This time last year, well, not this time, but like, if we go 3 weeks ahead, people were kind of laughing at the Falcons for, taking him after like, and I think that more and more teams, maybe not necessarily in the top 10 picks, but teams should be like each year being like, well, best player on the board is the QB. Like, it's so hard to find the quarterback, but so many teams are willing to like just be like, well, we have Kirk Cousins coming off an Achilles tear, and they give him the contract, obviously, but that there by the end of the season, the smart decision was to take him, and then he did show some really nice performances, when he did come in and get the start. But where's your optimistic radar here on Penix, and what did you think of him coming into the NFL?
Yeah, Penix is probably more in like that CJ Stroudish kind of bucket because he can run but doesn't run. It's not really his game, right? Like, so he's going to be driven by passing stats more than rushing for the majority of his career, and that's kind of was always the one kind of like bugaboo for him coming into comparing him to last year's quarterbacks from like a dynasty perspective, is that he was going to be more passing driven than some of the other guys, and we saw that even when he came back in last year. Like they basically ran the Kirk Cousins offense through him, and some of that could have just been they only had 3 games to work with him, and maybe this offseason there's a lot more install for him, but he is a drop by passer. Like he wants to push the ball down the field. Like that's his game. He wants to throw the ball outside the numbers. He wants to throw the ball down the field. So while I think that his ADP is largely fine, I probably will, attach him to, some teams that have Drake London. What I'm mostly excited about with Michael Penix is what he does for Drake London though. And I still think Drake London has a chance to be undervalued in fantasy because of this, because we've yet to see this full marriage. So what happened to Drake London, and the reason we were excited for him last year and what kept his ADP like inflated in like that Garrett Wilson area where like it hadn't come to fruition yet, but we're waiting to see it, was that Drake London for 2 years with Arthur Smith was like a sacrificial X kind of. He was forced to win downfield, outside the numbers, didn't have a lot of free squares in the offense, then paired with the low volume. We're like, all right, he's going to get Zach Robinson. Zach Robinson's going to unlock kind of like these free squares for him. And we saw him, get that super spike in slot usage. But what happened with playing with Kirk Cousins was Drake London also just kind of turned into Michael Pittman and like didn't have very much upside. And then when Michael Penix took over, because it was the marriage of both worlds. It was, hey, we are giving you these free squares as a slot receiver and these shorter targets and giving you access to those. But now we can move you downfield and do like it just all came together with him with Drake with the Michael Penix factor. So like I think like Drake London, I'm just really, I still think there's another gear for Drake London to get to. I mean, think about this. He had 100-yard game with Kirk Cousins. And then he had 2 with Michael Penix, like the final 3 weeks, because he can get now those free squares paired with quality downfield targets that he wasn't getting from Desmond Ridder and the Tyler Heineke's of the Arthur Smith era. Like, we're just blending now and making him a more complete player. And I think that's what is exciting for Michael Penix taking over the Falcons, is that it kind of could unlock like an extra ceiling for Drake London.
Yeah, and not to go into Drake London, but even with the season, and you mentioned with Kirk Cousins only one 100-yard game, but he finished the season 100 receptions, nearly 1,300 yards, 9 touchdowns. So if we're looking at a step forward, we're going to get some pretty massive numbers if we can add in those easier receptions and to go along with it. The last one to mention today, and I think this is, for me, is the one that is most overvalued out of the group here that we're talking through. It's Caleb Williams at QB 11 going in the 9th round. It felt like this time last year, the Bears had learned from everything that the Panthers didn't do for Bryce Young. They started to put these pieces around. They draft the rookie receiver. They have DJ Moore. They get DeAndre Swift. They have Keaton Allen. Feels like all the pieces are there. The season was a letdown. Everyone basically got fired. But what is your expectations here for a rebound, and like a rebound to the level of, he's already been drafted? I think he'll probably finish the season as, QB 10 to 16 range. But, we're drafting him at QB 11 here. It feels like it's just a whatever pick at that point. Like, we probably felt he's just in that range, but it's not going to do anything to win your championship.
And if it wasn't for Ben Johnson, I think his ADP would be a lot lower based on his rookie year performance. Like, he probably would have taken a bigger hit. But, Ben Johnson obviously has so much helium, going right now. That's like, all right, well, we're going to at least draft him similar to what his ADP was last year and see if maybe it was just the 1-year disaster thing. But, Williams did come into the NFL with a lot of faults that he did kind of carry over, and they could be something that are just like a career bugaboo for him. Obviously he, the sack taking stuff that everyone talked about was he had the second worst total of EPA loss for sacks in the 2000s. I mean, only the Bryce Young rookie year was more. And, 17, he took 17 sacks that were credited as his fault. Like, it wasn't just the Bears.
He hit some of those CJ Stroud ones as well, where it's like we're running in the wrong direction here. Just to stop. Throw it away. It's funny. He had a lot where it's like, just throw it away now, and it's like, took the sack instead. Lose the yardage as well.
Yeah, because it's funny, because like there was a streak where he went like 8 or 9 games without an interception, and like he had the longest streak without an interception.
That was the fakest streak of all time.
It was, and it was like, well, yeah, well, he's also taking like 60 sacks over that span, and we all know that.
And there's also about 5 dropped interceptions in that range as well.
We know sacks are adjacent to turnovers basically now. Like, I've done a bunch of data that shows like they are adjacent to turnovers. Outside of just being an actual turnover. But the only quarterbacks that had more, yards per pass attempt than him, last year. Like, you look at some of these guys that were ahead of him in pass rating, like Cooper Rush, Bryce Young, Daniel Jones are the only guys. The inaccurate throws too, like from an inaccurate throw rate, Mac Jones and Anthony Richardson were the only quarterbacks below him. So like, there was a lot that was still Caleb Williams. So it's just how much
selling it here.
Yeah, so it's just how much does Ben Johnson calibrate this? And this is the thing with Anthony Richardson we talked about too. It's just, you very rarely see like these types of things in the NFL course correct. Like, accuracy and like these types of things like are generally pretty sticky, and like sack taking stuff is like, this is all stuff that is relatively sticky. So how much
it's really hard to, like, if you're not accurate coming into the NFL, learn how to be accurate when you're playing against NFL defenses. Like, learn that when you're in college rather than when you're against better players in the NFL.
Yeah, and not just the Ben Johnson factor. I think giving him the kind of, we'll see, we'll give him another year, right? Like, that's basically what everyone's saying. And then you add the offensive line pieces. They add Tooney, they had Jonah Jackson, who was with Ben Johnson at Detroit. They signed Drew Dahlman, at center. So like, they're going to improve the offensive line paired with the Ben Johnson stuff. So like, there's a lot where people are saying like, all right, we're going to just see this one where his ADP is basically the same as it was last year. It's just like, he's kind of just in the same spot.
He got a mulligan for his rookie season.
Basically, that's what we're kind of giving him. I will say, like, he's a guy that is in that same bucket. Like, he doesn't have that gear. And, as when I was writing up last year's class coming in, and we talked about like him versus Jayden Daniels, I was like, well, from a fantasy football stance, like Jayden Daniels is still just a lot more appealing, because if it works out, he's just a type of fantasy quarterback that you can't combat. Whereas Caleb is a mobile quarterback. Like he's also never just he's not gonna give you like a consistent like Boku rushing numbers either. So he's more like in that guys that we talked about, like the Bo Nix, maybe probably a little more than Jordan Love, but those are guys that are capable of like getting out of their own way and running. So like that type of guy, like he's going to need to have like those Dak Prescott like early seasons, right? Like where you're getting rushing touchdowns from him, because the rushing yard are just going to be volatile week to week.
Yeah. I think that's been a lot of conversation around the second and third year guys. And I think it gives a kind of a palate cleanse for people. Maybe you're drafting already, gives you some thoughts for that. But if you're just getting into your draft rooms for some best ball drafting, or whether you're thinking about making some dynasty trades, give you some food for thought there. It's been awesome having Rich on. You can obviously follow him on Twitter at Lord Reeves. You can find him over at Sharp Football Analysis. Reeves, anything you want to highlight as we get ready to close out here?
No, definitely just check out my work at Sharp Football Analysis, where I've wrote up the entire rookie class and have been going team by team through every team's roster at this point too, approaching the draft too. So you can definitely check out those articles on your favorite team or non-favorite team.
Awesome stuff. So we will close it out there. We're going to talk some wide receivers on the next edition. My name is Colm Kelly. You can check me out on socials at Overtime Ireland. And until we are back, have a good one.